change recommendations as opposed to saying, here's the problems, and then not giving any recommendations to solutions. I got them. Thank you so much. We don't have any markers with this shame. If you can find one, that would be great. So what I want to do, I want to start by, first of all, introduce myself. I'm Karen Jacobson, and I'm part of the criminal justice faculty here. I've been with Governor State for 3 years. But prior to that, I've worked in the criminal justice system, going back and forth between academia and working in the system. I've worked in the prison system. I've worked in community-based corrections. I was an executive director of a reentry program that worked with women coming out of the prisons in Michigan, and they predominantly, 80% of them would come into the city of Detroit, and they came into about 7 zip codes. So we started a reentry program, particularly for women, because at that point, women just kind of got thrown into men's programs, and so we started one specifically for women. That's what I did right before I came here and started back into academia for a while. Living in Detroit, which I don't still want to live in Detroit, I just can't sell my house, but I'm still there. We have a very strong Latino population. In fact, my children are both in schools where it's 80% Latino and Hispanic, about 15% African American, and about 5% white. And so we are very immersed in the Latino population where I live, as well as my husband who works within the population. So this has been a big concern of mine, feeling that it's my community where I work. So what I want to start is talking about, when we talk in the criminal justice system, we talk about disproportionality, we talk about overrepresentation, and we don't really distinguish between those. So before we even begin really talking about the disproportionality of the representation of Latinos and Hispanics in the system, I think it's good to differentiate with some of this terminology. Back in about 1995, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention created an index numbering system. Excuse me for 1 minute, I'm going to grab a tissue. Did you get a marker? No luck, huh? Okay. I'll just talk slower. That's what markers really do for me, is they slow me down a little bit. But I can repeat anything. They created an index numbering system so that we could actually start to take a look at whether there is an or how much of an overrepresentation there were of minorities in every single stage of the system. So if you had an index of 1.0, that would mean that it's the same occurrence as in the general population. Okay, so that means it's representative to the population. If it is greater than 1.0, that would mean that there's an overrepresentation. And then obviously less than means an underrepresentation. So for example, if we had an index, and if you see this in statistics, of, not yet, and a little bit, thank you though, of 2.0, and they said that that's the representation, that means that we have twice as many Latinos and Hispanics in the system than we do in the population. Okay, so that explains this concept of the index of disproportionality that we see in a lot of our statistics. Now, how is this different from looking at overrepresentation? Overrepresentation, when we talk about that in criminal justice, that's by meaning we're looking at social forces. Okay, we're not strictly looking at empirical statistics, but we're saying there are social forces that are at play that develop different levels and patterns of delinquency. For example, would be police practices in high crime areas, which are generally poverty-stricken areas, which are disproportionately people of color. Disparities, then, when we talk about disparity, we're saying that there's a difference in treatment of these individuals. So we have overrepresentation, saying there are more than due to social forces. And then when we say the term disparity, we mean then those individuals are being treated differently. Okay, so all this terminology gets thrown around and nobody ever really explains what the differences are in these. And disparities accumulate as you go through the criminal justice system. So there are disparities at arrest, and as you can imagine then, these disparities will accumulate when we talk about going to trial, when we talk about a rate of conviction, and then when we look at sentencing. So it starts to grow as we go through this process. Because we know if you are in contact with the police, then you're more likely to be arrested. We know that if you're arrested, that people of color are more likely to be convicted. Upon conviction, we know that people of color are more likely to receive more severe sentences. Even after sentencing, we can take that disparity and continue through the system and look at likelihood of parole, likelihood of successful parole completion. And so this disparity filters through, or continues throughout the system. So what are the causes then of disparity and disproportionality in the criminal justice system? I want to start with an example of looking at delinquency. And Dr. Holdren was going to be here in center on delinquency, and that's his area, so I wasn't going to discuss it at all, and then he had something else that came up, so I thought I'd use delinquency as my example. First of all, we know, and anybody here who has kids or got in trouble yourself as a youth, that delinquency and getting in trouble as a kid is not an uncommon phenomenon. Okay, so it's a relatively commonplace part of our adolescence. And so a large segment of the American youth population gets in trouble with the police at one time or another. I know I did, quite a few times as a matter of fact. But now where the differences lie is in how across the racial divide. And this is a complex social problem. It has multiple causes. If we look at indicators of lower socioeconomic status, I teach a race, gender, and crime class, and I've asked for the word class to be included in there because it's not just gender and race, but it's also class. And unfortunately, the criminal justice system has moved away from looking at class as a variable in consideration in disparities in treatment in the criminal justice system. Because in the lower economic neighborhoods, crime is out in the open. So it's easier to target, it's easier to see, and police forces concentrate more so in those lower economic neighborhoods than they do in upper class neighborhoods. So right away we're starting with a disparity from the very beginning of even the contact with the police system. And then we have people of color are more so concentrated in lower economic neighborhoods. So therefore there's another disparity that's also right at play just by simple social forces, which is socioeconomics and race. Youth belonging to lower socioeconomic class are more likely to be detained than any other juvenile. Detained. So what happens is if we have a child or a youth that comes in, and they're from the lower socioeconomic status, and let's say they're a person of color, and then we have a person of means coming in for the same offense, police officers are more likely to call the parents of the family of means to have the kid picked up and dealt with within the home than the kid who comes from, let's say, a single parent household family, from a lower socioeconomic family, and also from a family of color. So we know that right away, simply from looking at empirical data and the differences of treatment of juveniles just coming into the police department. And so it's the type of community. Community has a very strong effect on the impact of juvenile delinquency and also the impact of how the criminal justice system is going to interact with that individual. So overrepresentation, when we talked about earlier, one of those social forces is law enforcement practices and decisions. Police have discretion. Oh, sure, I love someone.
Sorry.
It's okay. Police target, again, like I said, high crime areas, deploying more police to particular neighborhoods. So therefore, that would just simply, if you give more police, thank you, in a high crime area, you're going to have more arrests. Okay? Or in a poor neighborhood,